A life that's carefree needs hair that's worry-free. Have both with Maury. Reduce shedding and thinning in as little as 12 weeks with clinically proven, all-natural Maury nourishing hair care products. Others containing sulfates, parabens, and GMOs can actually weaken your hair over time. You can look great for holiday photos. Still not sure? We get it. So right now, purchase Maury at 50% off while it lasts. And take a quiz for a custom hair care recommendation at moerie.com. Results can vary. Maury is not a substitute for medical advice. See website for more.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way. Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
As time passed and investigators retired from their respective departments, the cold case ultimately landed back at the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Investigator Dan Westland started looking at the Mary Schlais case in late 2020. He reviewed the case file and saw that a partial DNA profile had been obtained from the hat scrapings and had been uploaded to CODIS, with no suspects being identified. In July 2021, Detective Westland started working with Bodhi Technologies in attempts to extract suspect DNA from additional items of physical evidence. On July 21st, he packaged and mailed 4 rootless hairs obtained from the suspect's stocking cap to Bodhi. Bodhi was able to obtain a partial DNA profile from one of the hairs, but that didn't provide any more genetic information than the partial profile already in CODIS. So on the recommendation of his connections at Ramapo College, Investigator Westland started to work with Intermountain Forensics on obtaining a SNP profile for this case. He sent to the lab, one of the first in the world accredited for whole genome sequencing for IgG, various pieces of evidence, including the extracts used to obtain the original STR DNA profile from the suspect's hat years earlier. In these extracts, there was ample DNA to work with, and in late August 2023, Intermountain Forensics reported that they were able to obtain a SNP profile from the extracts. The SNP profile showed that the suspect's admixture had significant Northern European ancestry, notably Swedish and Scandinavian. Remember, the hairs on the hat were blonde, consistent with this heritage. Then Investigator Westland turned to Karen Binder and her team of student genealogists at Ramapo College of New Jersey. You've heard me talk about Ramapo's Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center and their IgG certificate program in many episodes. The team agreed to tackle the case and uploaded the SNP profile to GenMatch and Family Tree DNA. The top match, a woman, shared 534 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect, consistent with a relationship somewhere between a first and second cousin to the suspect. Additional lower-level matches, including one who shared 75 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect, allowed the genealogy team to locate a most recent common ancestor. This led to the names of 2 men descended from this couple, a father and son pair, both of whom could have been the right age in 1974 to have killed Mary. The father of the father-son pair, John Barthel Pearson, had been born on December 21st, 1928, and died in 2001 in Washington. But Pearson had once lived in Goodhue County, Minnesota, which was near the Wisconsin border and the crime scene where Mary was found. He had a history of domestic violence. John had only one son of record. The initial Ramapo IgG report named John Barthel Pearson and his son M. Pearson and indicated to the investigators that the suspect was closely related to this family. So the Dunn County investigators wanted to track down M. Pearson, born in Ramsey County, Minnesota, on May 24, 1952. His mother was John Pearson's wife, Geraldine. After M. Pearson's birth, Geraldine and John divorced, and she retained custody of her and John's son, M. Geraldine remarried in Montana, and M. changed his last name to the last name of his new stepfather. So his new initials were M.G. Investigators learned that M.G. was alive and well and living in Casper, Wyoming. Investigator Westland contacted the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation and asked them to start surveilling M.G. and his wife to establish their patterns of behavior. Team leader Brad Reinhardt and his team watched the couple's home for a week and noted very little activity. However, on 2 sequential Mondays, the trash was put out at the end of the driveway for pickup by a commercial garbage disposal company. So the decision was made to snag the trash and see if they could find anything with MG's DNA on it. In January 2024, investigator Sergeant Jason Stalker and investigator Westland traveled to Wyoming and worked with the Wyoming DCI agent Brad Reinhardt. The DCI arranged for MG's residential trash pickup company to send an empty, sterile truck to his residence on pickup day. On Monday, January 29th, MG's regular trash pickup day, the workers collected the garbage from the bin outside his home, placed it inside the empty truck, and then drove to a meetup with Stalker and Westland. The officers went through the garbage with the assistance of 2 other Wyoming DCI agents. Investigator Westland set aside some items to collect that would likely contain DNA, used nicotine pouches, and a diabetic medication self-injector with MG's name on it. Doesn't get much better than that, a DNA-rich needle labeled with the suspect's name. They packaged and sealed up the items that included a cigar butt that some Wyoming DCI agents surveilling MG had seen him drop outside a Casper Menards store. Detective Westland transported the cigar, the diabetic injection pen, and one of the packs of used nicotine pouches to the Madison State Crime Lab on February 1st, 2024. Testing showed that MG was not the murder suspect, and his biological father, John Barthel Pearson, was also ruled out based on the levels of shared DNA. Now that they knew he hadn't done it, the Dunn County guys decided to interview MG in hopes that he could shed light on who the suspect was, or at least maybe reveal the name of another male cousin they should look at. Sergeant Stalker and investigator Westland arranged with MG to come in for a chat. On May 10, 2024, they went to his home in Casper, Wyoming. MG was amenable to talking with the investigators and welcomed them in, but he had his attorney and friend Donald Fuller present as well as his wife. MG said he'd been adopted at a very young age and couldn't recall much information regarding his biological father, John Pearson. MG described his bio dad as being a drunk with a violent temper, recalling a time John beat both MG and his biological mother, Geraldine, which is why she left him. MG knew nothing about John's brothers or sisters or any cousins he may have had on the paternal side of his family. MG was very helpful, though, in that he was willing to share his SNP profile with the investigators. He had already tested on Ancestry.com, so his profile was available for upload to GEDmatch. Detective Westland contacted Karen Binder right then and there, and she orchestrated the upload with MG's permission. It showed that MG shared approximately 700 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect, likely a first cousin or half-uncle. It was time to take a look at MG's close male relatives. And indeed, MG had a first cousin who could fit the bill. His deceased father, John B. Pearson's sister, Dorothy B., had a son I'm identifying with the initials DB. DB didn't quite fit with the known suspect profile of purely Northern European ancestry because, according to his publicly available pedigree information, he had some Native American heritage, while the suspect did not. But as we know, DB's actual genetic makeup could have differed from his public tree information, perhaps as a result of a misattributed parentage event somewhere in his family line. So the genealogy team recommended follow-up on 87-year-old DB to determine whether he could be the suspect. Westland and Sergeant Stalker went to interview DB at his home in a small town in Michigan on July 13, 2024. Even though Ramapo had named DB as a potential suspect as the last known male in John Barthel Pearson's family line, the investigators decided to approach him rather than get a surreptitious DNA sample. DB invited the officers into his kitchen, and Sergeant Stalker introduced himself and explained that they were investigating an old case. DB was friendly and didn't hesitate to answer questions about himself, his biographical information, and so on. He was born in Red Wing, Minnesota, and confirmed his mother was Dorothy Pearson, and his father was a man named Floyd. DB didn't really have any connection to Wisconsin, and when asked about a murder that took place in Dunn County in 1974, he clearly didn't have any information about it. He was happy to consent to the collection of his DNA for comparison to the crime scene DNA, and to the use of his DNA to assist in building out his family tree as part of the IgG analysis. He gave a buccal swab on the spot, and the search warrant that the investigators had obtained from the Michigan Attorney General's office was not needed. Testing on the STR DNA sample ruled DB out. This was both disappointing and disheartening because DB was the last known male family member in the Pearson lineage. Someone else was out there, someone directly and closely related to the Pearsons. The genealogy team and the investigators began to consider whether there might have been a non-paternity event or an adoption out of the Pearson family. The genealogy team expanded their analysis to look at the grandparent level to find other close male relatives to DB and MG. They started to focus on John Pearson and his sister Dorothy Pearson's father, John Pearson Sr. Interviews with family members told the investigators that John Sr. was a, quote, philanderer. He had had affairs with multiple women he was not married to. Who knows how many unidentified children he had fathered, and that would make tracking them down very complicated. But that also meant that the hypothesis that there was an unknown Pearson family member out there just might be correct. The genealogists turned to the killer's mother. She was, of course, unknown to them, but they knew that she had 100% Swedish heritage. They contacted the original top match, the woman who shared 534 centimorgans of DNA with the killer. She had been adopted and had uploaded to GEDmatch and opted into law enforcement searching in her quest to find biological relatives. It was felt that she would be amenable to being contacted, so the Dunn County investigators reached out. This top match agreed to share her list of genetic matches on a private DNA matching website with the Ramapo team. And on that website, she was matched to a cousin named Tina, whose father in her public tree was listed as a John Miller. But Miller's heritage wasn't clear, as no parents were visible for him on Tina's public tree. And the genealogists could not see in what way Tina and the top match were related. Could her purported father, John Miller, have been adopted, and his biological father was really John Pearson Sr.? If so, that would explain the close relationship between the top match and Tina, and would mean that Miller was the half-uncle to first cousins MG and DB, which matched the DNA relationships known to the Ramapo team. It all fit. Miller was the only person the genealogists saw who had been born in Goodhue County. Remember, that's where John Pearson had lived, and it was very near the crime scene. Miller had a criminal record, and his high school yearbook photo closely resembled the Mary Schlais suspect sketch. He had a pointed chin, long face, and blonde hair. Nothing documented that his real father was John Pearson Sr., but the genetic relationships, circumstances, and geographical factors all pointed to that being the case. It was time to look into John Miller.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way. Homes.com. Ding dong. We've done your homework.
Investigators contacted Tina, which was a bit of a gamble considering that she could have tipped her father off. But her social media bore no indication whatsoever that she even knew a John Miller, so they took the risk. Tina was amenable to speaking with them, so on November 4th, Investigator Westland and Sergeant Stalker visited Tina at her home. Also present were Tina's mother, Ruth, and Tina's husband, Thomas. Ruth had been married to John Miller, so the investigators were eager to talk to her as well. Tina confirmed that John Miller was her father, that he had abandoned her and her mother when she was an infant, and that she had no relationship with him. She also confirmed that he was adopted into the Miller family as an infant, and she did not know who his bio family was. Ruth explained that even John didn't seem to know who his biological parents were. As it turned out, the Wyoming and Michigan cousins, MG and DB, were not aware of John Miller. From Westland's report, quote, "Neither Tina, who seemed fluent in ancestry research, or Ruth knew of any of the Pearson family, whom I knew to be the correct genetic family as far as the crime scene DNA is concerned," end quote. Ruth recalled that the Millers adopted 3 unrelated children from a Minneapolis area children's home/orphanage. The investigators needed to be sure they were on the right track with John Miller, since it was totally unknown whether he had even been born into the Pearson family. It was a shot in the dark. So they decided to compare Tina's DNA to that of the suspect. Tina had already tested her DNA on Ancestry, and the interview was halted so Karen Binder could assist Tina in uploading her SNP profile to GEDmatch. For those of you who have uploaded to the open source databases and opted into law enforcement searching, thank you. You know how easy it is and how quickly you can see results. And indeed, the results from the upload of Tina's profile to GEDmatch showed that she shared 3,585 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with the suspect sample, consistent with a parent-child relationship. Her father, John Miller, was the suspect they sought, and Tina and Ruth had no reason to believe that he wasn't still alive and living in his hometown of Austin, Wisconsin. Spoiler alert, he was. Okay, so who is this Miller? John Keith Miller was born on May 2nd, 1940, presumably to John Pearson Sr. and an unknown mother. As we heard, as a baby just months old, he was adopted into the Miller family, along with a boy who was named Jay and a girl named Merle Dean. The 3 grew up together, but we don't really know anything about John's early life. A lot of what we do know was related by his ex-wife Ruth, Tina's mom. She was married to John Miller from 1973 until 1977, during which time Mary Schlais was killed. Ruth verified that they lived in the Twin Cities for some of that time. Before they married, when she was 19 and he was over 30, John traveled with a carnival he worked for many years as an assistant to one of the carnival bosses. This took him all over the country. After the carnival job ended, Miller bounced around from one job to the next while she herself remained gainfully employed, Ruth pointed out. Miller worked at Here Ski in St. Paul for a time and also worked at Burnett Dairy in Alpha, Wisconsin. He also held a short-term job at Copper Tree Restaurant where Ruth worked. This was in 1976. She remembered the year because it was the year that Miller abandoned her and their daughter. Miller was fired from the restaurant job for reasons Ruth couldn't recall. Ruth indicated that her marriage to Miller was far from idyllic. They had met in Austin, Minnesota after she moved there with a friend. The friend's boyfriend had introduced the two. They were married in May 1973 and moved into a trailer in New Hope, Hennepin County, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. When Ruth was pregnant, Miller started disappearing for days at a time. He would take her car and all their money and leave Ruth for days, with no indication of when or whether he would return. When this happened, Ruth would call her family and they would track Miller down and see to it that he would come back. Ruth couldn't recall where he was the first time, but the second time he was found in Las Vegas. Then he disappeared again after Tina was born. They were living in Pine City, Minnesota at this point. Her family tracked him down in Wisconsin and made him return to her and the baby. When Tina was about 2 years old, sometime around June of 1976, Ruth came home and found a note that said, "Sorry, I can't do this anymore." This time, Miller never returned. Ruth never saw him again. But when Miller left, he stole her car, a blue 1971 Gremlin. It was finally located in Washington State, and the family had to use the services of an attorney to get it back. The detectives asked Ruth some personal questions about her marriage. Ruth said she heard that Miller was having an affair with a neighbor while they were married, but she chose to look the other way. She said there was nothing unusual about their sex life, but on one occasion, Miller took her and a male friend to a lingerie show. I assume this means a strip club. And she was very uncomfortable and upset about this, so they left. As for why Miller left her and Tina, Ruth said she assumed he left because he didn't want to be tied down. He was nomadic and had spent his life moving around, and with a wife and baby, he couldn't do that. Ruth also recalled that her family suspected Miller of stealing a firearm from her father prior to him leaving Ruth and Tina. She had no idea about this until her father told her about it many years later, and it was never proven. At the end of the interview, the officers collected from Ruth some photos of Miller in the 1973-1974 timeframe and photos of the blue 1971 or 72 Gremlin that Miller had access to at the time of Mary's murder. It was time to reach out to John Miller. The octogenarian was living at the Traditions of Owatonna nursing home in Wisconsin. He had moved there from Austin, Minnesota, just over a year earlier. According to Forum News Service, he had lived in the Twin Towers apartment building, a block from the local police department in Austin, for 16 years. On Thursday, November 7, 2024, Sergeant Jason Stalker and Investigator Dan Westland and Minnesota BCA agent Brent Peterson went to the facility at 195 24th Place in Owatonna. They learned that Miller lived alone in apartment A219. The investigators briefed an Owatonna police officer that they had a warrant for the arrest of John Miller. She remained outside the door, just in case. The three went up to apartment A219 and knocked on the door. It was answered by an ancient-looking man who confirmed that he was John Miller. Investigator Westland identified himself and Sergeant Stalker as being from the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. The two asked if they could come in and speak to Miller, and he acquiesced. He sat on a couch, and the two officers seated themselves on nearby chairs. The officers were very friendly and asked Miller to please call them Dan and Jason, and they maintained an upbeat and non-threatening demeanor during the whole thing. Miller was wearing a long-sleeved striped navy sweater, track pants, and a baseball hat with very large black plastic sunglasses perched on the brim. He's a tall, lanky dude, old as the hills, with a super scraggly white beard that brings to mind Dan Aykroyd's nasty faux Santa beard in Trading Places. Westland started out by telling Miller that Miller could help him out. He said it had been a long road to get in touch with him while working through his family tree. If Miller was surprised by this revelation, he didn't show it. Miller confirmed that he'd been adopted by Merrill and Grace Miller, who were both now deceased. He'd been told that his birth name was Donald Keith Johnson. His adoptive parents kept only his middle name. Miller confirmed that he had one adopted brother, Jay, who was deceased, and one adopted sister, Merledine. Miller said he had never heard the name Pearson and couldn't recall any information regarding his biological parents. He knew only that his mother had had an affair with a man from Yugoslavia, which was wrong based on the fact that the genetic associations in Miller's lineage imply his father was John Pearson, not from Yugoslavia, which isn't even a country anymore. Note, by the way, that Miller never once asked what all this was about or why the investigators had his family tree in front of them. If some cops showed up at my door, you can bet the first thing I'm going to ask is, what is all this about? Miller didn't do that, and investigators consider that something of a tell. Asked for background information, Miller said he grew up in Austin, Minnesota, which is about 90 minutes south of Minneapolis, and he attended Austin High School. He didn't graduate because, as he put it, he got in trouble during his high school years. He explained he forged some checks so he could buy his girlfriend Barbara a Christmas present. Aw, how thoughtful. The investigators played along with Miller, downplaying this, saying, "Oh, forgery, haha." Miller said he ended up getting his GED, but then he went to work for a traveling carnival based out of Iowa. He did that for more than 10 years. The carnival traveled the country, so Miller was always on the move. When not working, Miller would couch surf with friends. He volunteered that his job at the carnival involved running the game where contestants try to throw a ball into the milk jug. He also was the designated driver of the carnival workers' shower truck, which I was very glad to hear they had. At this point, investigator Westland told Miller, "Look, John, if at any point you decide you don't want to talk to me because I'm law enforcement, just let me know." Miller nodded that he understood, and they continued. Miller couldn't remember dates very well and chuckled often over his inability to recall things like the years his daughters were born. He said he married his first wife, Diane, at age 24, and had a daughter whom I'm not naming and with whom he did not keep in touch. He was married to Ruth when Tina was born in 1974, and they lived in a trailer in Pine City, Minnesota. During their marriage, he worked at the same restaurant as Ruth, but he got fired because he refused the manager's demands that he replate uneaten food from bussed tables. I love that Miller's fine with murder, but drew the line at violations of restaurant food safety standards. Anyway, he cheated on Ruth with the babysitter and said that was the reason his marriage fell apart, which was not what Ruth maintained. He told the investigators that he'd spent about 18 months in California's San Quentin prison after robbing a gas station, which they already knew. He laughed softly when he talked about that and said he had zero recall of where he picked up the gun he used. They reminded him of what Ruth had told them, that he had stolen a gun from her father. He said, "Oh yeah, that's where I got it, heh heh." Miller said his favorite hobby was fishing, and he enjoyed bow hunting with his dad. Asked about his daughters, he said he didn't really have relationships with them, and he was a bad dad. He chuckled again. Of course, the investigators wanted to know whether Miller operated a gold or amber two-door compact car in 1974. They asked him what he was driving when he was married to Ruth. He said a 1972 Gremlin. What color? Miller didn't hesitate. It was blue, with a stripe down the side. John denied having any other vehicle during this time period. The investigators noted that Miller was careful not to state any association with Wisconsin and to downplay Minneapolis. He talked about Alaska, Texas, Seattle, California. He only acknowledged Minneapolis when they brought it up. Westland told Miller that Ruth had said they lived near Minneapolis for a time. Miller pretended not to remember this and said, "Well, I did live north of Minneapolis. How far, I don't know." Westland showed Miller a map of the area, and he said he didn't see well and claimed he really didn't know. It was time to tighten the screws. Westland said, "So, John, the case that we're looking at, there's DNA from many years ago." He explained to him that they take the DNA from the crime scene and they build a family tree, and the units of measurement help them find who contributed DNA to the scene. Miller is nodding along during all this. Does that make sense? I guess. Westland said, "What led us here is a homicide." Okay. Westland said they knew where the DNA came from and, quote, "You can't escape DNA. It is what it is. Your DNA was found at the scene of a crime." Mine, Miller says? Yes. Westland says a lot of evidence beside the DNA was pointing to you, and the DNA was the last part of it. I don't want to just accuse you. I'd like to hear the side of it from the person who owns the DNA, because there are always two sides, whether it's a mistake, an accident. You got me curious now, Miller says. They explained to him a woman was murdered. She was stabbed. She was left on the side of the road. There was a vehicle description. There was a description of the male, and now there's the DNA. That's why we're here. That's weird, Miller says. Westland says, "You have to tell me why your DNA was on the scene." I don't really know what to say. John, I need you to think what your answer will be here, because I have only one opportunity I can give you. The girl went missing from Minneapolis and was found an hour and 45 minutes after she was last seen. The family needs the rest. Your DNA was found on the scene, and it's time for you to talk. I don't know what you're talking about, Miller says repeatedly. Westland says, your DNA was found next to the dead woman. I have no idea. This must be like those things on TV. What's it, a cold case? Yes, says Westland. Well, I can't help you out. I don't know what to say. Westland's report says, quote, after further denial, we remained silent, during which I observed a tear coming from John's left eye. They sat there, letting Miller percolate over what they had just told him. Suddenly, Miller stated flatly, all right, I did it. I put her in the snowbank. Is that enough? It was an accident. This was about 40 minutes into the interview. They waited. He gave more details. I had a fishing skinning knife on my visor. I asked the lady if she would give me a blowjob, and she said no, and she bent over. So I reached up, grabbed it, I hit her once, and I can't believe it, she was dead. So I drove off the area, and I went and put her in the snowbank. And there was a car that came up behind me, and I figured, well, I'm caught, so I left. Miller said in the paper the next day they gave an entirely different color of the car, and he figured he got lucky. Westland said, I'm glad you're opening up to me and getting this off your chest, and I'd like to talk to you in more detail. There's not that much more to talk about, he says. Westland said he'd like to continue having this man-to-man conversation with Miller, but that Miller is not obligated to continue to speak with him. He says if he's willing to continue, they would read him his Miranda rights. Miller agreed. Westland read the rights, and Miller said, yes, I do, when asked if he understood them. His attitude continued to be somewhat nonchalant, as if none of this was a big thing. I'm going to read a very long excerpt here from Miller's confession. While it's tempting for me to summarize it to shorten this episode, I think his words and thought processes are very interesting. This is from Detective Westland's report, quote, I then asked John, are you now willing to answer questions or make a statement? And John stated yes. I went on to ask about what vehicle John was driving, and he said a 1972 Gremlin. He claimed he did not know her name, referring to Mary. John stated she was hitchhiking with her thumb out. However, he did not recall the general area of where he had picked her up. John chuckled here that it was a long time ago. Heh heh, that's my addition. John pulled up next to her and reached over, opened the door, and asked if she needed a ride, and she then got in the car. John asked her at one point if she would give him a blowjob, and she said no and bent over in the front seat. John again stated he reached up and grabbed the fishing knife from the visor on the passenger side, and boom, that was it. John could not recall the location this occurred, later stating he pulled off on the nearest exit from the highway to, quote, get rid of her. John said he hit her in the back with the blade and it penetrated her, however, not very far. That's why I couldn't figure out, wow, she's dead. John stated he threw the knife away. He stated that after this happened, he put her in a snowbank. However, he did not directly state why he had come to Wisconsin, only stating that he got off the highway and found a dirt road spot to put her, and this is when he saw the other car. I figured I was caught. John stated on the next day when things didn't jive, he figured he got away with it. Again, stating he thought he got lucky. I always thought a lot about it. Every once in a while, it would come back. Westland tells Miller that it's good he's telling all this because it's going to help the family heal. Miller is nodding along as though he actually cares. What did you do in the days following? They asked him. Just kept on going, I guess. I explained to John that she had more than one stab wound and asked for a further explanation, with John again stating the same explanation as before, insisting that he only stabbed her once in the back. John, that's not true. It is true. I remember one time in the back. Oh man, if I did, I do not remember. I remember her stabbing her one time, that's it. Let me remind you here that Mary was stabbed multiple times on both the front and back of her body. It's very hard to believe Miller's story that this all went down as she sat in the passenger seat. Investigator Westland told me that crime scene photos led them to believe Mary was clutching her throat, perhaps trying to stem the tide of blood from an open wound. And at one point, she was definitely face down. Recall that Dennis Anderson believed he saw a young man being pulled out of the back seat of the gold car. Was Mary lying in the back seat? And if so, what was Miller doing to her there? Back to Westland's report, quote, I asked John if he had sex with her and he denied any sexual contact with her. So there would be no reason why your semen would be at the crime scene? Correct. Let me state here that the modern investigators were experiencing the frustration of all cold case investigators, inconsistencies in the case file reports that cannot be resolved because of the passage of time. The original pathologist had posited that Mary had had sex 12 hours prior to her death, but there were inconsistencies in the reports about whether any intact sperm were found or not. If the 1974 pathologist was in error about the freshness of the sample collected from Mary's vagina, then there remained the possibility that Mary had indeed been sexually assaulted. Miller denied it, but obviously he can't be trusted. They pressed Miller about the area where he dumped Mary, which he had never been to before, he said. Quote, John could recall no better details after viewing the map, just stating, I guess I don't know. I showed John a picture of the suspect sketch and asked him who it looks like. I got no idea. I then showed John a picture of the hat at the crime scene and asked John to tell me what I was looking at. John looked at the picture and said, that's my stocking cap, looks like one I had. I don't even remember losing it, to be truthful. Just to interrupt here, Miller and Ruth both reported that Miller had attended Austin High School. A little digging quickly informed Sergeant Stalker that Austin High School colors were orange and black, just like the hat. Back to the report about the interview. Quote, I showed John a picture of Mary at the scene of the homicide, asking John to tell me about the picture. Do you remember this girl? He looked at the picture for a while and then says, truthfully, no, it probably is that hitchhiker. Pause. Occasionally I think about what happened, but I try to push it away. Westland asked him again if he had sex with her, and he says adamantly, no, I did not. That I remember. She was dead when you pulled her out of the car? Yeah. Do you remember how long after you picked her up you stabbed her? No, I don't. And you were driving the 72 Gremlin at the time? Yes. I asked John about any blood in the car, and he said he wasn't sure. Oh yeah, I got some on my pants. John said he ripped the side of his pants and told people he went skiing and hit a fence, causing the tear. John then went to get a new pair of Levi's at the mall. He said as he drove home, he threw the knife out the window in a slough. He said he could show it to them as it was on the way to his trailer. Westland wrote, I knew this trailer to be the one he and Ruth lived in, at or near Pine City, Minnesota. John added the slough was a place he did fish often, describing it as being along a road, with based on his explanation sounded to have cattails, and this is where he threw the knife away in the water. John was pressed more regarding more specific details. I asked John why he did it, and he said, I don't know. To this day, I don't know. Maybe because when she said no, I figured I was in trouble and better get rid of it, referring to Mary. Who knows? Only me. And then he chuckled again. There was silence. Miller broke it after almost a full minute. You know, when you walked in the door today, I knew right away what it was going to be about. Did you, they say? Yeah. Well, what made you want to sit and talk to me about it, Westland asks. Feel better. Have you ever done this to anyone else? No. Quote, I asked him what should happen to him for this, and he stated, go to court, get sentenced, and get locked up. How's that make you feel, Westland asked. Stupid, he chuckled. Have you ever looked up the case since then? No, I just tried to shut it out. He never told anyone about it, he said. They asked if he wanted to say anything else, and he said no. Westland said he wanted to be able to tell the prosecutor that Miller had told him the complete truth. Silence for 2 minutes. And then Sergeant Stalker asked, do you recall why you were in Minneapolis that day? No, said Miller, but then he volunteered some more information that showed that he did remember. I hardly ever went to the cities, but remember that movie Deep Throat? Myself and many others headed to the theater to watch that movie. I think that's the reason I was in the cities. From the report, quote, it was later found that this Deep Throat was a pornographic movie playing in the cities at the time at a local movie theater, end quote. Okay, I'm going to pause here to explain that Deep Throat was a very famous and impactful 1970s porno movie about a woman who could only achieve sexual climax by giving oral sex to men. I challenge you to look up the plot of the movie on Wikipedia and not laugh out loud. But aside from being a pitifully ridiculous male fantasy vehicle, Deep Throat was actually critically acclaimed for non-plot reasons. Anyway, so while John Miller's wife Ruth was pregnant, He went to Minneapolis to see Deep Throat in the movie theater, and then he picked up a hitchhiking Mary on the way home and decided to demand a BJ. You can't make this stuff up. Back to Westland's report. Stalker asked, "What else did you talk about on the car ride?" Miller just repeated the same story about asking for sex. He denied remembering where Mary was going or what she was doing. Stalker asked Miller what happened to Mary's things. "I have no idea. Don't even recall if she had anything." "Was there blood on the seat of the vehicle?" they asked. "I think I must have wiped it up." Miller reiterated the story he had told his family about the ski accident where he ripped his Levi's. But he never specifically said there was blood in the car. But the investigators knew that if Mary's slaying indeed went down in the car, there had to be a lot of blood inside that vehicle. When they asked how Miller got her out of the car, he said he got her out of the front seat. This did not mesh with what the original eyewitness, Dennis, said, which was that he saw the body being pulled out of the back seat. "How did you know she was dead?" they asked. "I was a pathologist assistant. I worked surgery. I know life and death," he said. This was in San Quentin, he explained. Miller could not recall with certainty if he had had the hat on or if it was just in the car, but he said, "I was probably wearing it." Miller told the investigators that after he read the news articles in the day or two after the murder, in which the car described was not his, he knew he got lucky. But then he said, "Luck runs out," and chuckled. Stalker asked him if they were going to find other crimes that he would be linked to through his DNA, and he said no. Westland asked Miller, "Why, if this has been so on your mind for so long, why didn't you ever come forward?" He said he didn't know and mumbled something about getting away with it. Miller never admitted to stabbing Mary more than one time. He never explained the injuries to her face. He didn't remember what he did with her sweater, coat, purse, and overnight bag. He didn't recall the route he drove to the dump site, and he didn't recall the direction he took when he left. But his confession was enough to confirm what the investigators already were confident of. He had killed Mary Schlais, and he had done it casually, impulsively, and with virtually no afterthought.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible. Financial geniuses. Monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com.
Ding dong.
We've done your homework.
Next, they brought in a local police officer to execute a search warrant for DNA samples by collecting buccal swabs. Miller sat placidly as his cheeks were swabbed. He recognized that he would be leaving with the officers, but showed no emotion about this. Miller also gave consent to a search of his small apartment, but nothing of evidentiary value was found. He sat himself in his wheelie chair thing while the search was conducted. They then placed him under arrest for the murder of Mary Schlais. But the whole thing was very congenial. The officer said, "Just to be clear, you're now under arrest and we're going to go down to the police station. Do you need that walker?" He said yes, and off they went in a sort of snail-paced processional. Owatonna police officer Luke Selvig and his partner arrived and helped Miller creep out of the building using his walker. Once outside, Miller's hands were loosely handcuffed in front as he clutched a handkerchief, and he was placed in a police car for transport to the Owatonna Police Department for further questioning in a custodial setting. I almost felt sorry for him. The buccal swabs were hand-delivered to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Madison and turned over to DNA analysts for comparison to the DNA from the black and orange hat. Once in an interview room at the police station, Miller was made comfortable, the cuffs removed. He continued to clutch a bandana hanky in his hands. I'd like to see here that I asked Investigator Westland whether the tear he had seen coming from Miller's eye right before he confessed was a genuine sign of remorse. He told me he had no way of knowing whether Miller was crying or just had watery eyes. The way Miller was clutching his handkerchief throughout both interviews leads me to believe he was used to needing one, meaning he was suffering from allergies, not a guilty conscience. The investigators asked him how he was feeling about everything, and he said he didn't really know. He chuckled. Kinda glad it's over, heh. Detective Westland went through the Miranda warnings with him again, and he again said he understood them and waived his right to remain silent. He agreed to answer questions. The officers showed him a photo of Mary in life, and he didn't recognize her. Asked again to come clean, Miller told the exact same story he had told them back at his apartment. In response to their questions, he said he had no recall of more than one stab wound, he didn't know why she had defensive wounds, he didn't recall losing his hat, and so on. Quote from the report, John again stated he only remembered killing her, getting lucky, and his luck ran out. Westland said, so you told me you killed her because you had to get rid of her because she denied your sexual advances. Yes. Sergeant Stalker pushed, telling Miller that his story did not mesh with the facts. Mary was stabbed multiple times, he said. You don't forget that, you don't. I do, Miller said. She had multiple stab wounds. There was a fight. She tried to protect herself. Her hands were both cut up. You might not want to remember that, John, but he interrupts, I don't. Miller says, I know what I remember, and I don't remember doing that. I honestly don't. Stalker says, I don't believe you. Miller says, I don't care if you believe me or not. I know what I think I did, and I don't remember any of that other stuff. This was the first instance of belligerence exhibited by Miller. They showed him the photos of Mary's hands. I've seen them, and they're gruesome. Her hands are cut to ribbons. He said she must have grabbed the knife, but I don't remember that. I don't remember any of that. They showed him a photo of the scene in the snowbank, and they asked him if he remembered it. He said, if that's where they found her, that's where I put her. I don't remember. That's the truth. I just gave her a ride, and I should never have done that. I don't know what else to say. He offers to take a lie detector test to prove he doesn't remember. They press him, this was a significant incident. We don't believe that you don't remember any more details. Then he said again, I don't care what you think. They asked him again about the blood in the car. There had to have been blood all over the bucket seat, they say. I have no idea. There was significant blood loss. How did Ruth not notice, they ask. I don't know, he says, frustrated. He says he got blood on his pants and had to go buy new ones. That's all he knows. Westland says, John, we think you stabbed her when she was in an upright position. No, I didn't. I stabbed her in the back, he reiterated. When pushed for more details about why Mary would have been leaning over in the passenger seat, he said he thought she had bent forward to cry. She was crying, sobbing. Why would she be crying? I don't know, got no idea. I'd cry too if someone threatened me. And there was an opening. The officers wanted to know more. Was he threatening her with the knife? Was that why she was crying? Miller admitted yes. He threatened her with the knife. She bent over to cry and he stabbed her in the back. But the investigators knew that Mary had been hit in the face and had multiple defensive wounds on her hands. This is from the report. Quote, I told him this didn't make sense for the facts known of the homicide scene. Something else happened in the car. John continued to deny anything further and stated he didn't care what we think. Stalker said, it's not what we think, it's what the evidence tells us. Miller chuckled, you're wrong. When confronted with how his skiing accident details did not make sense as to why blood may have been on the passenger side of the vehicle, Miller stated, I don't care, and chuckled. Miller then said he didn't want to talk anymore and he wanted to lie down. Okay, the investigator said and halted the interview. Miller then said he also needed a toilet. When I gotta go, I gotta go. Okay, they said, we'll get you to a bathroom. While he was waiting for the officer escort, Miller said, I'm just curious how my DNA got into the system. Stalker said, what do you mean? And he said, well, how did my DNA get into the system if I've never done anything? It was at the scene. It was a several years long process, just like I told you at your house, Westland says. Miller clearly didn't understand the genealogy component, and they didn't bother explaining it to him again. Westland said he was being charged with first-degree intentional homicide. If you want to talk to us, let someone in the jail know, he told him. Miller was then turned over to Owatonna police officer Luke Selvig and transported to the Steele County Jail. After the arrest on November 7, 2024, Sheriff Biggs notified Mary's family. He then made a brief public statement in which he said, to finally put a bow on it and have someone in custody who is still alive after 50 years, it's exciting. As for Mary's brother Don, he told KARE 11 he was overwhelmed and surprised. It's just been so damned long, he said. While preparing for trial, the investigators went back to Ruth and Tina. On Wednesday, November 13, 2024, Sergeant Stalker and Investigator Westland conducted a second interview with Ruth at her home in Minnesota, and her daughter Tina was also present. Ruth handed over several pictures of both Miller and her blue Gremlin, thought to be a 1971 or 72. The officers noted that the rear tires appeared to be, quote, more aggressive than the front and possibly a wider tire. This had been mentioned as a possibility based off photos of the tire impressions at the crime scene, end quote. The tires on the car Miller and Ruth both said he had access to were consistent with the evidence at the scene. So Dennis Anderson had been right about the possible make, model, and vintage of the car, but had gotten the color drastically wrong. Looking for more confirmation, the detectives asked Ruth about the fillet knife. She said she couldn't recall ever seeing a knife kept in the car or anything at all being kept in the visors. They asked her what her husband wore when it was cold outside, and she said he wore an orange stocking cap, but she didn't remember what had happened to it. They talked about whether Miller ever came home claiming to have had a skiing accident. She said Miller did not ski. She didn't think he'd ever tried skiing in his life. She also did not remember the car ever having stains on the seat. Quote, Ruth could recall no attitude or behavioral changes during their relationship, just stating John was always kind of quiet. Ruth explained that John had a more laid-back personality and seemed to give the impression that John let things roll off his shoulders. When asked if she'd ever really seen John mad, Ruth stated she had not, end quote. Ruth said she never knew her ex-husband to be violent, but he was certainly no angel. They asked her about anything else Miller might have done. She said once when they were at her sister's house in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, getting ready to go to the state fair, the police came through the doors with their guns drawn and arrested Miller. Quote, John was gone only a few hours and upon his return stated it was a mistake. Ruth found out later that John was questioned about robbing a liquor store, and Ruth's brother Ed always assumed John did it, as the suspect in the robbery was a tall, blonde male with a blue car. Nothing further ever came of this incident, end quote. John had also told Ruth that he did time in Chino, California, but this was before she had met him, and she had no idea what he was convicted of. And of course, the family believed that he had stolen a gun from her dad. Investigator Westland interviewed Miller's only surviving sibling, Merle Dean, on February 7, 2025. She was not close with Miller and had only vague memories of seeing him and Ruth and Tina at the holidays. However, quote, Merle Dean described him as always being pleasant and normal, stating she never thought him to be the type to harm a person, end quote. But there were red flags. Merle Dean told the investigator that growing up, Miller was constantly in trouble for stealing things from herself and her father, including babysitting money and tires. She specifically recalled that Miller was somehow linked to a robbery at a corner store when he was living in the Austin, Minnesota area, but she had no details. She hadn't seen Miller since the death of their mother in the fall of 1992, more than 30 years earlier.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible. Financial geniuses. Monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Homes.com has collaboration tools to help home shoppers search, share, and discuss home shopping with family, friends, and their agent directly through the site. Though it was fun to get that email from your husband about that 3-bedroom in the hills, to which you replied via text that you would never live in the hills and you'd like to find a 3-bedroom closer to the beach. To which he replied, "Why are you so uncompromising?" A fun way to spend an afternoon, but we think it's just a tad bit easier our way.
Homes.com.
Ding dong.
We've done your homework.
The investigators tracked down Miller's first wife, Diana. She had married him in 1965 after she came up pregnant at age 17. Her parents made her marry him, even though she caught him in bed with another woman on the eve of their wedding. Her parents told her she had to marry him or give the baby up. The baby was Miller's daughter, whom I'm not naming. The couple lived in California, Austin, Minnesota, and Racine, Wisconsin. Diana told the Vault podcast that being married to Miller was horrible, and he was a very cruel person. She filed for divorce in 1967, and her divorce filings allege cruel and unusual treatment. Diana said Miller broke her jaw and dragged her down the street. As she was screaming for help, he told everyone she was just drunk. He wouldn't let her get treatment for her broken jaw. Diana said Miller would disappear for days at a time, just as he had done when he was married to Ruth. After their divorce, he had no contact with their daughter. Okay, so the investigators had gathered a lot of evidence against Miller. He looked like the suspect sketch, tall and thin with blonde hair. He drove a car that fit the description of the suspect vehicle, sort of. He had a criminal record and a history of violence against women. Oh, and he'd confessed. But even more persuasive than the confession was the DNA evidence. When the testing on Miller's buccal swabs was completed and his DNA compared to the scrapings from the orange and black hat, it showed that there was a 1 in 9 billion chance that the killer of Mary Schlais was anyone other than John Miller. Forum News Service conducted significant background checks on Miller for their podcast about the murder of Jolie Truelson, a crime the journalist host felt Miller should be looked at for. I'll touch on that some more at the end. A lot of this information on Miller comes from their podcast The Vault, as well as my own research on newspapers.com. Miller spent time at the St. Cloud State Reformatory for forgery-related convictions he had racked up in 1959 and 1960. Remember, he admitted to the detectives he had forged checks so he could buy his girlfriend a Christmas present. He had stolen checkbooks from his siblings and father. His intake paperwork reflected that he was 6'2", 137 pounds. While in the reformatory, he had 2 misconduct reports. In one instance, he was put in solitary for using profanity and having, quote, lewd books in his cell. He was paroled in 1963 and was free and clear by January of 1965. He next popped up in Arizona, presumably while working for the traveling carnival. In September of 1965, he was arrested in Flagstaff for an attempted burglary of Flagstaff Auto Supply. That arrest linked him to another burglary in Austin, Minnesota. I assumed that he was linked by fingerprints, but the Vault reports that the police somehow connected him to burglary of a service station in Austin because Miller had a carton of cigarettes on him that was stolen in that robbery. He had also made away with a shotgun and $275 in cash. Miller admitted he had kicked in the door of the Flagstaff store to try and steal stuff. It's unclear where he did time and how much. He was sentenced to 2 to 3 years, but a vagrancy arrest in Prescott, Arizona 13 months later shows that he was on the streets pretty quickly. By 1967, he was in California, racking up a couple of arrests for petty theft and burglary. It got more serious in 1969 when he was arrested and convicted in California for armed robbery after threatening a convenience store worker with a loaded gun. This next bit all according to the Vault podcast. Transcripts included in court documents related to the 1969 California conviction reveal, quote, he was characterized by feeling that he could con his way through life, end quote. A probation officer report in December of 69 indicates that Miller told his PO on more than one occasion that he had considered seeking psychiatric help to get to the root of why he kept offending. He asked for counseling. This sounds to me like Miller figured out exactly what he was supposed to say. I know I need help. And it clearly worked. Miller was given 5 to life in August of 69 for the armed robbery, but spent less than 3 years in prison and was released from San Quentin on May 5, 1972. At that point, he returned to Minnesota, and public records reflect a John Miller living in the Minneapolis area. At the time when he killed Mary, Miller was 33 years old. He'd been married for about a year to his second wife, Ruth, who was 3 months pregnant. She gave birth about 6 months after the murder, and they divorced in 1977. 48-year-old Miller was written up in the papers again in December of 1988. The Austin, Minnesota Daily Herald reported a traffic citation for John Miller of Mandeville, Iowa. This one was a massive traffic citation for driving without insurance, driving an unregistered vehicle, a plate violation, and open container. Reportedly, he also has a DUI dating back to 1994. On November 11, 2024, Sheriff Kevin Bigg held a press conference announcing the arrest of John Miller. He thanked the IGG team from Ramapo College right off the bat. This case was significant to both Ramapo and the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. It was Ramapo's first IGG solve resulting in an arrest, and it was the Dunn County Sheriff's Office first usage of IGG to solve a case. This is a huge victory for our agency, Sheriff Bigg told the assembled crowd. Sergeant Jason Stalker discussed the vast amount of investigative work done over the previous 50 years. If you've worked for this agency for any amount of time, you've known about Mary Schlais and her case. It was commonly a topic of discussion even after all these years. Stalker said that the investigators always knew that the orange and black hat found lying in the snow at the crime scene would be important, but they didn't know how important. As we know, it was DNA obtained from the hat that led to the identification of John Miller. I believe that the primary reason the hat was retained in evidence all those years was because of the 38 hairs that were found on it. No one realized the evidentiary value of the hat itself until modern DNA extraction technology came along. Stalker emphasized one sobering coincidence. We found John Miller on November 4th. That would have been Mary's 76th birthday. David Gurney and Karen Binder of Ramapo both spoke. They talked about the complexity of the IgG in this case and asked the public to please consider uploading their DNA to the open source databases so families like Mary's can get answers. Detective Westland told the crowd that Mary's case never collected dust. The agency worked it the whole time, but had to wait for DNA technology to catch up. He thanked the individuals who shared a genetic relationship with Miller, the cousins contacted by law enforcement, MG and DB, and of course, Tina. As Westland said, they welcomed us into their homes. He also said at the end of the day, we need to remember Mary, an accomplished artist, equestrian, sister, aunt, and daughter. Sheriff Bigg gave an interview to the Wausau Pilot and Review. He said, "To know that we can go to Mary's family, her brother and sister-in-law and niece who are still alive, and bring them some closure is an incredible feeling." Bigg had been an employee of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office for more than 35 years, and investigators had been working Mary's case throughout his entire tenure. Quote, "To finally send a text to some of my former coworkers who have since retired that worked on this case over the years and say, suspect in custody in Mary's 1974 homicide, you know, it's pretty unreal," Bigg told the publication. Okay, now for the legal stuff. 84-year-old John Keith Miller was charged with the first-degree murder of Mary Schlais. At his video arraignment on November 12th, he was ordered held on $1 million cash bond. His preliminary hearing, scheduled for November 21st, was rescheduled until December 4th and then December 13th. In the meantime, as an arrestee charged with violent felony under Wisconsin law, Miller was required to submit a DNA sample. He knew it would be a match. On December 13th, Miller waived the preliminary hearing and entered a not guilty plea. All the pretrial motions and discovery began. Miller was represented by public defenders Shelley Tomczyk and Travis Sartorius, who requested a speedy trial. While Miller was sitting in jail as his case wound through the legal system, reporter Lou Raguse of KARE-11 wanted the scoop. He wrote the incarcerated suspect a letter, and Miller agreed to talk to him. Raguse went to the jail and spoke with Miller on one of those handheld corded phones separated by a glass divider. Miller is hunched over holding the phone with his long, stringy gray hair, oversized glasses, caterpillar-like eyebrows, and bulbous nose. He looks like a semi-deranged Gandalf. And Miller surprised the reporter by speaking very frankly and saying, "I did it." Raguse said, "When people hear that, they might think you're cold-blooded." Miller just laughed for several moments and then explained what happened. "I picked her up in Minneapolis, I asked for sex, and when she said no, I stabbed her and put her in a snowbank. Maybe I have no feelings, I have no idea. Like, I went down aisle 5 and picked up some pasta." So for anyone wondering whether these guys have a conscience, there's your answer. Miller didn't give a second thought to senselessly taking the life of a promising young woman because she wouldn't give him a blowjob. Here's some more of their dialogue. Miller: "I just figured I stabbed her and put her in the snowbank and that was it, and that I got away with it." Raguse: "Did you ever tell anyone what you did or talk about it at any time?" Miller: "No." Raguse: "How often did the crime pop back into your head? How often did you think about it over the last 50 years? Miller: "Hardly ever." Raguse: "And why do you think that is?" Miller: "Maybe I'm cold. I think I am cold-blooded." Raguse asked him about the hat. "Did you know at the time that you'd left it there?" Miller: "I didn't know I left it there until I saw the pictures." Raguse: "And when you saw the pictures, did you recognize that it was your hat?" Miller: "Yep. Yes, I did. I never thought anything would be traced back to me. That's just the way I was thinking." He continued to say, "Some car pulled up behind me, and I thought I was caught. But the next day in the newspaper, the guy described my car, but it wasn't my car, and I figured, well, I got away with it." Miller told Lou Raguse the same thing he told Stalker and Westland, that he never killed anyone else. And then, the shocker. Miller told Raguse he planned to plead guilty to Mary's murder. Quote, "Because I know I am. Why go through all the mess? Put me away for the rest of my life." The reporter asked Miller if he felt sorry for Mary and her family, and he said, "Yes, I do." The reporter asked if he planned to say anything to them, and he said, "No, I don't think it'll make a difference. Sorry's too late." The prosecution had not heard anything about Miller pleading guilty, so this interview was a surprise to them. But sure enough, his counsel was receptive to a plea deal. It seems as though Miller was pretty quickly fed up with all the legal wrangling and red tape, and since he was confessing to anyone who would listen at this point, a plea deal worked for all parties involved. At a status conference on February 21st, 2025, Miller's attorneys signaled their client's intention to accept the plea deal drawn up by prosecutors, who, I am sure, were happy not to have to try a 50-year-old case. The plea and sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 27th, 2025 at 2 p.m. At the hearing, Mary's family was in attendance, her niece and brother sitting in the front row. The prosecutors showed the police confession video and the video in which Miller confessed to reporter Lou Raguse. They said it highlighted his lack of remorse. 18,528. That's the number of days it took to bring Mary Schlais' killer to justice, said Andrea Nodolf, the state prosecuting attorney. Miller's defense lawyer, Shelley Tomczyk, described her client as a man of few words and said the only regret he expressed to her was his hesitancy to confess when the detectives first confronted him with the DNA evidence from the hat found at the murder scene. The judge asked Miller if he'd like to say anything, and he responded, "No, sir." The judge then reviewed the information and charging doc with Miller to be sure he understood all the charges. He said he did and ended up pleading no contest to first-degree murder. Judge Peterson said, quote, "We have to give you some credit for taking some responsibility, for pleading and trying to make this go as smoothly as possible. But I don't know if there's anything that could make up for the loss of life." There weren't any surprises with his sentence. The judge handed down a mandatory sentence for Miller of life in prison. If you see this guy, I think you'll agree he won't serve much time. It may be a life sentence, but it won't be long at all. Miller was also ordered to pay Mary's family $2,200 in restitution, which they announced they were donating to Ramapo to fund IGG investigations to help other families, a class move. Afterwards, at a press conference, Mary's niece, Nina Mary Schlais, who never got to meet her aunt, spoke to the crowd. She said, "Today marks the end of a 50-year journey, one that is filled with loss, perseverance, and finally justice. While no verdict can undo the pain of losing Mary, we take comfort in knowing that the man responsible for her murder has been held accountable. Our family wants to be here, not for what we just witnessed in the courtroom, and we have nothing to say to him, but we want to be here to express our gratitude." End quote. She then thanked the Dunn County Sheriff's Office and the Ramapo team and said their work showed that justice has no time limit. Quote, "Let Mary's case be a testament that persistence, science, and dedication can bring about long-awaited closure. While we mourn what could have been, today we stand in gratitude for the scientists and investigators and their relentless pursuit of truth. But most of all, we stand in a remembrance of Mary, whose light continues to shine. Mary Schlais was more than a victim. She was a brilliant and independent woman, a gifted artist, an equestrian, a world traveler, and a scholar. She has been discussed and her life talked about thousands of times. I only wish my dad and my grandparents were here. We have plans to visit the University of Minnesota, where she still has or has had art exhibitions. And now we can celebrate her life and think about the 25 years she was here, and not just the moment she was taken from us. Is there closure? I think closure is a process. But yes, I think we have continued to feel relief. Sadly, whenever we thought about Mary over the years, we always think of what happened to her. And I think now we can think about who she was as a person. The sentencing of John Miller finally wrapped up the 5-decade-long Mary Schlais homicide investigation. As Resolve Forensics Lab, which worked on the sample from Miller's hat, posted on LinkedIn about the role of DNA in cold cases, it isn't if anymore, it's when. Amen to that. Whether John Miller killed anyone else is unknown. He said he didn't, but whether he is to be believed is impossible to know. It's worth noting that the investigator who interrogated him, Dan Westland, does not for a minute believe that Miller fails to recall what he did with Mary's sweater, purse, hat, and coat. He doesn't believe that Miller recalls stabbing Mary only once. And he doesn't believe that Miller is telling the truth when he denies killing anyone else and claims to have killed for the first time at age 33. As far as I know, Miller is not a suspect in any specific cases. In Minnesota, none of their cold cases occurred in areas he was known to frequent. But there is one unsolved case, the vicious 1974 stabbing slaying of 14 and 12-year-old sisters Mary and Susie Recker in Stearns County, in which advanced DNA testing is underway. At the time of the girls' murder, just 5 months after Mary's, John Miller was living an hour away in Pine City, Minnesota. He is not currently considered a suspect because the Stearns County investigators have not been able to place him in the St. Cloud area, but he has no ties to Dunn County, Wisconsin either, where he dumped Mary. Another case that many armchair sleuths believe may be connected to Miller is the 1972 murder of Jody Trulson. 16-year-old Jody was known to hitchhike and was picked up while thumbing a ride in Lake Calhoun, Minnesota on July 3, 1972. She was found the next day in Minnehaha Creek in Minneapolis with 2 serious wounds to the back of her head, which were fatal. As in Mary's case, a witness, Jody's friend Sue, described a compact gold car and the driver being a white male around 30 with collar-length brown hair. According to Forum News Service, Minneapolis Police Detective Mark Suchta interviewed Miller about Jody's case. Miller denied any involvement and has always maintained that he had only one murder victim. There are many who don't believe him, including the Trulson family, which has written a letter requesting that Miller be looked at in Jody's case. But there is no certainty that John Miller was in Minneapolis in July 1972, just a few months after his release from San Quentin. And Jody's cause of death was quite different from Mary's. And I'd like to point out that the one thing that was thought to connect Jody's and Mary's cases, the gold 2-door compact car, doesn't actually connect them at all. We know from Ruth that the car Miller was driving at that time was blue, something Miller said was misreported in the articles he saw about the murder. The gold color perceived by Dennis Anderson was simply him misremembering amidst the trauma of what he witnessed. John Miller chuckled repeatedly over getting lucky with the wrong color car in the witness description. So the car was blue. I don't believe that it's possible that both Dennis Anderson and Jody Trulson's friend Sue mistook a blue car for a gold one. And one would hope that if Miller were responsible for other murders, whether the Recker girls, Jody Trulson, or anyone else, he would have found it in his tiny, shriveled heart to reveal his culpability, since with a life sentence he has nothing to lose. But if I've learned anything over 5 years of doing this podcast, it's that we cannot expect these killers to act like rational people with normally developed senses of empathy. John Miller seems to have given Mary Schlais very little thought over the 50 years he lived free, since he stabbed her simply because she would not give in to his sexual demands. Someone who can think so little of taking another human life could be capable of anything. Mary, I am so sorry this happened to you. I hope you can find some peace now that the monster who took your life is paying with his own. Thank you so much to Investigator Dan Westland of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, and to Karen Binder, the Assistant Director of the IGG Center and the Director of the IGG Certificate Program at Ramapo College of New Jersey, for speaking with me about this case. And if you're one of the bad guys, they are coming for you. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. Before you leave, please let me tell you about some important things related to the show. If you'd like to support this podcast, and in the process, get access to early and ad-free episodes, as well as bonus content like crime scene photos, you can sign up for a Patreon subscription for only $5 a month by heading over to patreon.com/DNAID. Of course, you're welcome to contribute more than $5 a month. We rely on Patreon funds to pay for the original source materials I use to research each episode. If Patreon isn't your thing, you can also show your support with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. It costs just $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. Your AbJack Insider subscription will give you the same benefits for not only DNA ID, but for all of the shows on the AbJack network, like Killer Communications and Campus Killings. Head over to Apple Podcasts and find the DNA ID page, or look for the AbJack network to get started. If you're on social media, we'd love to interact with you there. DNA ID is on every major social media platform. Search your favorite platforms for DNA ID Podcast to find us. We also have a YouTube channel, and our website is dnaidpodcast.com. You can find links to all of these anytime in our show notes. If you need to reach the show, contact us by emailing dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Finally, if you want to pick up some fun DNA ID merch and represent the show, visit the store at www.customizedgirl.com/s/DNA ID podcast. DNA ID is researched, written, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call. You talk to one of them, they stay anonymous. I can't hang up. That's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.